Go ahead, please take a seat. Morning, C3 and guests. Thanks for joining us here excuse me. Must have been that breakfast, I don't know. We'll see if we can get this straightened out. All right, thanks for joining us here in person. It's risky, but it's fun to join us in person or to join us here online. I thought I'd start with a little quiz. Now, those of you who may be in person here might be a little better off than this, but what is it that I am holding in my hand? What am I holding in my hand here? And if you're online, you could drop a comment in, but if you're here, this is the one time you really want to be in the front row. What am I holding here? Anybody? Okay, an acorn? No. This is an oak tree. Today we're continuing our series called ReNew, where grace meets goals. And in this series, we're looking at how every year around the time of January, we start thinking about changes that we need to make in our lives. Maybe, pardon the pun, even oak tree-sized changes that we want to see in our lives. And so we make resolutions and all these promises, but those aren't often the path of change in our lives. And so we've introduced this concept of renewal because it's a concept that I believe better explains God's process of change in our lives because it offers us grace for the journey. Last week, we looked at a simple definition for renewal. We'll put it back up on the screen here just so that we're all on the same page of what we're talking about with renewal. So when we talk about renewal, we talk about the concept of becoming new or as if new again, or to begin again, or to be restored to a former state. And I think it's those concepts of returning back to a former state or beginning again that offer us the grace that all of us truly need if we're going to be on the path of renewal. So throughout this series, we're going to be looking at different renewal habits that we need to remember. So last week, we talked about how we need to give grace. We need grace on this path. Sometimes when we have just resolutions and thou shalt nots, we end up going down a path where we're trying to change ourselves through shame and condemnation, and those don't actually help us to become different people. Grace is the power that all of our lives need to actually change us from the inside out. So if we're going to be a people renewal, we need to remember to give grace both to ourselves and to those around us. So that was our first lesson. The second one that we're going to learn today, which is actually the lesson of the acorn itself. And it's a little bit counterintuitive for us. That's why I did the little trick at the beginning. And this lesson that we need to remember today is celebrate small. We need to learn to celebrate small, to pause and acknowledge the incremental changes that God is bringing into our lives. We can't just wait until we hit some milestone or cross the finish line. We need to take time and to re-energize our journey by seeing how far God has brought us, even if it's a process. Listen, even if it's only a process that moves inch by inch. And so that's what we're going to try to learn today. And it's, I believe, something that is very counterintuitive to the way our culture typically celebrates things. You know, if you turn on the TV and see where awards are being handed out, normally our culture waits until there's a finished product to present. Something monumental has been achieved. And then we pause and we applaud and we acknowledge big accomplishments, but we aren't really good at celebrating small. And that's true for church as well. It's not just a problem that's out there in the world. It's a problem right here as well. Sometimes in church, we applaud people who know a lot about the Bible, or we sit around and we applaud missionaries who travel thousands, tens of thousands of miles in order to bring the message to another part of the world. And we applaud these major achievements, and we fail to recognize the small steps, the years of study, the numerous sacrifices that all go into those great things. And so we miss this concept of celebrating small as a church. And the unfortunate, unintended consequence sometimes of this only celebrating big is that some of you, maybe many of you, can be hurt in church. You know, maybe a Christian came up to you and they looked at your life, and they were only people who celebrated big accomplishments, and they saw your life and they made you feel like somehow, because you weren't there in your journey yet, that somehow your accomplishments didn't matter. You felt condemned by them, or just made to feel like your accomplishments just didn't really measure up to much. And if that's you, if you're here today or watching online, I want to invite you to change the way you're looking at your spiritual journey. Not that it isn't a failed journey, but something that you're just beginning again. And maybe you'll need to begin it again and again and again, because God's renewal process is here to offer us the grace that all of us need in order to change. And that's a journey that as a church we'd love to celebrate with you every single step of the way. So let's take a moment and learn this lesson about how to celebrate small. And we're going to learn by actually looking at what Jesus says about the concept of a seed. Jesus uses this image of a seed 19 times in the Bible. It's one of his most strategic and frequently used metaphors in the Bible, and I think he does it for a couple different reasons, because using the concept of a seed shakes up the way that we think about greatness. It changes the way that we think about things and how they grow. And therefore, if we're going to be renewed and we're going to be transformed, we need to be shaken up by this concept of celebrating small. So let's take a look at some of the stories Jesus tells about seeds and understand how this is a key to understanding the renewal process that he is offering to every single one of us. So the first one we're going to look is in one of the biographies of Jesus' life written by Mark. In the 4th chapter, we'll look at the first 8 verses of that, where Jesus talks about someone who went out and sowed or spread some seed around. This is what it says. Mark 4, verse 1. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered around him, so large that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on the rocky ground, where it didn't have much soil, and it immediately sprang up, but since it had no depth of soil, when the sun rose, it was scorched because it had no root, withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seed fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. So here Jesus, at a most fundamental level, is telling a parable about a guy who goes around and spreads some different seeds. And it's meant to help us to define a concept of greatness. You'll notice from the story, Jesus tells this parable because large crowds are beginning to surround him. So in the face of Jesus's rising popularity, he tells a story of a first century Johnny Appleseed who goes around and spreads the good news of God's renewal, a term that Jesus is going to use to talk about his kingdom, his renewal process. And while there's a lot of details that we could explore in this parable and about all the other different soils, at a most basic level, Jesus is explaining something very simple. That even though he's really popular right now and all these crowds are surrounding him, most of the folks surrounding him aren't going to stick around to the end. 3 out of the 4 soils don't end up producing anything. And so Jesus is challenging us to recognize that his popularity in that moment does not define what true greatness is. That all those people in the crowd, which in that day would have shown how awesome he is and how popular he is and how influential he is, that those typical measures of greatness in that day and even today are not going to define true greatness in Jesus's kingdom. In essence, he's telling us that if we're going to be on his journey of renewal, we need to learn our big idea today, which is that we need to celebrate small. That Jesus didn't use the big crowds in order to transform the world. He took his 12 ragtag followers, and through investing in them, he was able to transform the face of the world. And so we need to be careful about what our culture says is popular, new, hip, amazing, what's going to change us, or even what church culture says, this is the next big thing or that thing, because oftentimes those measures of greatness don't produce much. And we need to look at Jesus and his example for how renewal truly takes place. And Jesus' kingdom does grow. In fact, in the story here, it describes that last soil, and it grows. It grows a bunch. 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. This grain is doubling and doubling and doubling again. It's like my Bitcoin account. It's just growing and growing. Just kidding. If you don't know what cyber currency is, be sure to consult your tax advisor before making any investment decisions based off what your pastor says on a Sunday morning. But his point is clear. This thing is going to grow. It's going to grow and grow and grow. And so Jesus takes this idea of this growing seed, and then in a parable a few verses later describes how is this thing going to grow? What is the process through which this seed of renewal grows? And so in Mark, a little bit later on, still in chapter 4, verse 26, he talks about the process of this growth. Mark 4:26 says, "And Jesus said, 'The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows. He knows not how. The earth produces it by itself, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle because the harvest time has come.'" Now, I know I mentioned this earlier, but Jesus uses this word kingdom to describe God's renewal process. As we looked at this concept last week, the Bible is a story about God's desire to renew the face of the world. The Bible begins with the story of a perfect place, a garden where God is living with his people and things are in harmony. That garden is lost. And so at the end, God talks about a renewal city that he's inviting people into. So between between the garden and the city, these images in the Bible, Jesus uses the concept of the kingdom to describe that in-between place where we're in the mix of God's renewal between the beginning and the very good end. And so Jesus talks about kingdom as a way to describe God's renewal process. And so here he talks about the kingdom, and it's growing, but it's growing in an unexpected way. The farmer is there, and he plants the seed, and he goes to bed, and it's growing. And he's not able to perceive how the seed exactly is growing. And I don't think Jesus is merely saying that the guy doesn't understand like the mechanics of how seeds grow. I think he's saying kind of what a popular cliche is in our culture. You know, you can't sit and watch the grass grow. So here's this farmer, and this mysterious seed is growing because he can't perceive it growing, because it's growing bit by bit by bit by bit. Or we might say that this thing is just growing inch by inch. And that's why I think Jesus says here in verse 28, first it produces this, then it produces this, then it produces this. It's showing the process of incremental growth that leads finally to harvest day. And when it's harvest time, he recognizes that it's done, and he cuts it down for the harvest. And I think that's a lot of the struggle that many of us have. We become discouraged along the journey of God's renewal in our life because we don't see that growth happening in us. Because then we haven't learned the lesson of celebrating small, or we might even say we haven't learned the lesson of celebrating inch by inch. So if we're going to become a people who learn this concept of how to celebrate small, here's a couple concepts that I think we need to understand from this passage. The first thing we need to understand is we need to celebrate inches. That if the daily way that God intends to grow us is incremental, then we can't wait for some big milestone in our life before we pause and acknowledge what God is doing inside of us. We need to learn how to celebrate spiritual crumbs along the journey, because oftentimes it is a process that we're only moving a little bit at a time. And if we don't intentionally pause and acknowledge the bit-by-bit growth that God is doing in our lives, we will be quickly discouraged and stop pushing forward on the journey ahead of us. We need to learn to value spiritual growth, even if it happens inch by inch. I'm sure a lot of you probably saw 2 weeks ago, John Madden passed away. It was on the billboards here and on the news and pretty much everywhere else. And for most of us, I think John Madden was kind of a household name for folks. Although if you were like me, it wasn't because I watched a lot of football or his football commentary. I knew John Madden because of the video game. Like that's really where I first kind of knew him was the game called Madden. I mean, the thing became synonymous with his first name because kind of it was all about his personality coming through. And the first version of the game probably came out, I don't know, maybe in my high school years, some 30 years ago or 25, depending on how young you think I look. And I was younger then, and I didn't value, the inch-by-inch reality. So every time I played Madden, it was always, I would always go for these Hail Mary bombs. I mean, it was fun, right? I mean, you just set up, you'd put all your receivers out there, and you just chuck it for the end zone. And even though it was fun, it really wasn't all that successful. Anybody who knows the game understands that you just can't set up every play for a Hail Mary bomb into the end zone, although maybe Ben could pull one out today, hopefully, maybe. Just one, there's got to have one left in that arm of his, just one left in there. But anybody who knows the game knows that you can't just do that. Football is, sometimes the big plays are set up by small ones, and sometimes victory just comes just by trudging it out and earning the yards. Honestly, if you can just get 3 yards every play consistently, you'd be unstoppable. And that's the lesson that we need to realize when it comes to our spiritual growth, that we need to value growing in inches. And so when we're learning to celebrate small, we need to celebrate inches. Another lesson that we need to learn is that we need to celebrate people as well. You'll notice in this story about this farmer, he doesn't really know how the growth occurs. There's a little bit of a mystery about how people grow. And I think that's a good reminder for us, and it helps us to celebrate people, because when we acknowledge that transformation is something that we don't fully understand, then we can look at people in our lives who maybe they're not where we think they should be, and we can just humble ourselves and say, you know what, I don't know everything about them. I don't know everything about how God is moving in their life, and I'm not the master of spiritual growth, and so I can celebrate their journey even though if I don't fully understand it, or if I don't even fully think it should be where it is. I'm just going to pause and say, I don't know everything about this person, and celebrate them a little bit. And I think it allows us to celebrate God's unique growth in us as well, because sometimes we're the worst critics of our own spiritual growth, and we need to look into our own lives and say, I don't know everything about what God is doing inside of me. I may not have the best sense of having my finger on the pulse of my own growth. I know for my kids, most of my kids are in their teens right now, and as any of you in that same kind of growth spurt time in your life, did any of you this Christmas have like a relative come up to you and say like the cliche, oh, you're getting so big? And I remember as a kid, many years ago, back when I was growing, like going through those Christmases where, every relative would grab my cheek and pinch it a little bit and say, wow, I can't believe how much you've grown. And I'm sitting there, a 13, 14-year-old kid, like, I don't even know what they're talking about. Because for me, when you see it every single day, looking in the mirror, you don't notice that. You don't see those changes happening in you. But when people who don't see you very often get to enter into your life, they remark on how much you have grown. And I think that's true for us spiritually as well. We may not be the best judges of our own spiritual growth. I'm getting a little fuzzy here. Make sure it's not my phone. And so I fixed it. That was incremental right there. That was definitely incremental. And then it was sudden. So we aren't the best judges of our own. So understanding, celebrating small allows us to give ourselves grace for where we are on the journey. And it actually brings us to our third bullet point here, because when we understand this mysterious growth within us and we are willing to celebrate small, at the very essence of it, what we're learning to do is to celebrate God's power. That it's acknowledging that the strength to change comes from God into our lives. And so whether he's got us on this path of a journey or this with more ups and downs and turns, we acknowledge and celebrate it because we're seeing his hand growing in our lives. And this, I think, is the hardest one for us to continually remind ourselves of. All of us want to be in control. We want to grab the reins of our own lives. And I think that's really a lot of what we feel in January, like, this is up to me, I need to do it. And we're always tempted to forget that God is the one who is doing the work inside of our lives. Even Jesus' first followers, sometimes they're called the disciples, sometimes we're going to see here in a moment, they're called the apostles, whatever. It's all a bunch of different titles. Even them, for all their fancy titles, needed reminded constantly that it was God's power that was transforming them, not their own. Here's just a real quick seed story from Jesus. Luke 17, it says, the apostles said to the Lord, that's Jesus, increase our faith. And Jesus said, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Now, I've got here a mustard seed. It's a lot harder to see than the acorn. This is an actual mustard seed in my hand here. And Jesus's point is, I think, pretty straightforward. He says, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you could do incredible things. That's kind of an odd way of making a point. But I think what he's saying to them is that they don't understand the dynamic of God's power in their life. They're thinking of faith as if it's some kind of ability within them that will help them make changes, like it's some kind of spiritual lever that allows them to force God to do changes in their life. And he says, no. If you just had the smallest little bit, you could do anything that you want. Spirituality is not like, I think of it like a Marvel movie where, the disciples think of it as getting more abilities for themselves. Like Iron Man, he's in the workshop and he's adding, he's got rockets here and he's got something on his forearm here. And he just wants to add more abilities to himself so that he can be transformed. And Jesus is saying, you've got the math all wrong. The littlest bit of faith, because it connects us to God's insurmountable power, is all that you need. It's not about you. It's not, renewal is not about spiritual mastery where I become some kind of great titan to the faith. It's all about growing in dependency, not mastery, because just a little bit of faith, can move mountains. In learning how to celebrate small, ultimately, in the end, is learning how to celebrate what God has done through Jesus. You see, there's two main sections in the Bible where Jesus talks a lot about seeds. It's Mark 4 that we saw, and then Matthew 13. Feel free to read those on your own today. There's a lot of great stuff there. But both of those sections in the Bible, those seed beds, end with a story of Jesus going back to his hometown. And he goes back to his hometown, and nobody sees anything special in him. They're sitting around and they see him and they say, oh, hey, we know who you are. We know your mom and your dad, and we know the school that you went to, and we know even know the alley you used to ride your big wheel down, Jesus. And they all laugh at him and they see nothing significant in his life. He just looks like a little seed, which God, through his death, planted in the ground, unrecognized as a hero, mocked and forgotten. And so God planted his renewal seed in the ground. And then 3 days later, Jesus was resurrected, announcing that through his tiny life, God was going to work his renewal for the entire world. And so I invite you to learn to celebrate small with me today, to look at your spiritual journey, not as am I there or not there, but as a process of taking steps. You see, there's no spiritual crash diets. There's no hitting the spiritual lottery. It's all about moving in small incremental steps towards the place that God has for us. And so if you're here and maybe you're new or a little bit unsure about this whole Christianity thing, let me invite you to take a small step. Maybe you showed up here today, and if you were rated on a scale to 1 to 10, you're like on a 10 on feeling like this Christian thing wasn't for you. But maybe after listening to this concept of the seed, maybe you're more of a 7. And celebrate that incremental growth, that you're moving from maybe being really, really skeptical to being someone who is a little bit curious and would like to find out more. Maybe you're still relatively new to the faith, and you're interested in taking the small step of baptism. February 13th, we're going to be celebrating baptism here at C3, and baptism is just acknowledging that God is beginning the renewal process in your life, right? We lower into water and raise back up to show the newness that God is at work in us. And it doesn't mean that you're perfect. It doesn't mean that you have figured everything out. It means that you're beginning the journey of following Jesus, that you sense his call on your life and you see that he's doing something inside of you. It's just a way to publicly acknowledge that you have begun that journey. And so if that's you, I invite you to sign up for baptism. You can do that on our website, c3wheeling.com. Just click on the register here and let us know that you're interested in baptism. I'll reach out to you and we'll start the conversation of what that might look like. But I'm sure for a lot of you, you've been in the faith for a long time. And for you, it's a lot harder to learn how to celebrate small, because when you've been on the journey for a while, you feel like you've got a track record. And you feel like you have higher expectations for yourself. And when you fail, you're a lot less forgiving of yourself, because you feel like, and you can probably say this, by now, I should be blank. I really want to invite you to learn how to celebrate small, to recognize that the path that you're on is in God's hands, that he is a loving and caring Father to you, that he's begun a good work in you and he's going to see it all the way through to the end. And it's not always a straight line. It isn't always victory after victory, but it is always governed by his care, his love, and his mercy for you. And so even if you're at a place in your journey where you feel like you're just scratching along, dragging yourself, continue to celebrate that grace of God that is in you, causing you to desire to keep moving forward. We all need to learn different ways for us to keep moving forward. One of the ways that we try to do that here at C3 is by offering a potential next step to the big idea so that you can continue growing after you leave here. So here's our next step for today. Let me invite you to take 5 days this week and end them by celebrating 5 small steps of faith. You don't even have to remember to do it every single day. See, there's grace in everything. Just pausing at the end of the day and say, what can I celebrate? And if you get to the end of the day and you say, I've got nothing good, try harder. Don't go to sleep, until you do. This might actually help many of you sleep better by ending your night thinking about what small thing can I celebrate that God did in my life today? What small step towards my goal did he help me to accomplish today? And pause and celebrate that and allow that to be your mindset as you rest and place yourself in his care as we go to sleep. So think about little ways that you can celebrate God's power inch by inch as you learn to celebrate small. And for you guys here in person, I've got something special for you. I've got some mustard seeds to help us to remember to celebrate small. So here, you get a mustard seed. You get a mustard seed. You really want to be in the front row for this one. Feel like Oprah. You get a mustard seed, right? Okay, so we've placed some mustard seeds out on the tables as you exit, so you can actually, probably for the first time, see what I'm talking about here. I'm not making this up. Those are real seeds. And grab one, take it with you, and allow that just to remind you of Jesus' story, that small can lead to great things, especially when we're using it in order to tie into his renewal process for our lives. And that's what we want to do. We're learning how to celebrate our path of renewal. Every year we go through this same cycle as a culture where we want to make big oak-sized changes in our lives, and yet we forget the simple lessons of how things truly grow. We end up thinking that by our own willpower and strength, we're going to lay out all these great goals and we're going to get things done. And we fail to acknowledge that a lot of habits begin as tiny little seeds that grow bit by bit by bit, and sometimes we don't even see all that they're doing. Look, you have two options in how you pursue change in your life. You can go the way that our culture typically does and go down that path, and all the way along that journey, sit around and go, are we there yet? Or you can change your thinking today. Learn to celebrate small. Go down a different path where we're acknowledging what God is doing in our lives inch by inch. And instead of sitting around complaining, are we there yet? We can pause and say, wow, look at how far God has brought my life. The choice is yours, and we're making it every single day. We can learn to celebrate small successes or drag our lives over the rocks of our shame and disappointment and mistakes. And the choice is always yours. But Jesus gives us lots of reason to go down the path of grace, learning habits of renewal that can truly transform our lives. Like we saw last week, we need to be a people who learn how to give grace to ourselves and to other people who are on this path with us. And one of the ways we can remember that grace is by remembering to celebrate small, just like we're learning to do today. We learn to celebrate small because we know that even a mustard seed of faith can move mountains. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the grace that helps us to grow, that you desire to see us renewed, transformed, to be the best versions of us that you desire and have designed us to be. And so help us to choose wisely, to steer clear of the condemnation and shame that comes from laying out resolutions and absolutes that give us no flexibility, and let's seek the path of renewal that comes from you. Thank you for your care over our lives. We acknowledge your kindness to us as we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.